My name is Jake Schwartz. I'll be the first talk here of a few this afternoon on investigating gilt silent estrus. Like you said, part of the Swine Vet Center group in St. Peter, Minnesota. So some goals for my talk here this afternoon. First, to define silent estrus, what exactly that means, and maybe share some clinical observations of what this feels like at the slat level, and maybe what we did in response to the issue and what's worked and what hasn't worked. I know Dr. Neeram has some shared experiences with this issue, and he's going to get into some of the data analysis from a production standpoint in dealing with the issue. And I think, Joel, we kind of have the easy part of this afternoon. Dr. JP, Dr. Knox are going to get into some of the diagnostics. So gilt fertility syndrome, what does that mean? To put it in the simplest terms, having otherwise normal, healthy, the right aged animals that should be sexually mature, either one, not exhibiting any signs of estrus at all, or maybe exhibiting very weak signs of estrus, getting bred anyways, and the end result is lower farrow rates and increased cull rates. A little bit of background information. So the system that I'll be describing, 23,000 sows, 5 farms, pretty healthy at this point in time, 1 mycoplasma positive herd and 1 PRRS positive herd. So I don't want to get into the data too much. I know Joel will cover that, but to give you a little bit of perspective about what we're talking about, this column on the far right, that's just the percent of animals that were selected to be bred that were otherwise normal, healthy looking, that end up getting culled. And so you can kind of appreciate from that previous slide, there's some variability from group to group. And so that's something that we witness quite a bit is we would have good weeks on farms where, let's say, only 15% of the lot ended up getting culled, and then we would have, and it felt like things were getting better for a period of time, then inevitably we would have another bad week where, for instance, we end up culling 30 or so % of a lot. So over time it kind of waxes and wanes. So, like I kind of said earlier, of that 15 to 30%, there's a portion of the animals that show no signs of estrus at all, ever. And then there's a portion that maybe shows some very weak signs of estrus, but don't ever truly lock up or stand to be mated. I think everyone can appreciate the signs of estrus in a gilt, but on the ones, not to confuse the issue, there was signs of estrus in these animals, but I'd say there's too many animals with too weak of signs, and so it wouldn't be uncommon to get a little bit of vulva swelling, a little bit of reddening, a little bit of mucus, but when you get the boar in front of these animals, you don't get a pure lockup. And the best way I can describe it is many look like they're supposed to stand, like tomorrow you go by her, she's going to be standing, but they just don't. And then, so from a technical standpoint, the technicians on the ground, you can imagine, over time it gets pretty frustrating and lost confidence when it comes to heat detection. So in the context of when this was happening in this system was a little over a year ago, last summer. And so at that point, some of the questions that we asked ourselves, is this the worst summer in estrus that we've ever seen in our life? Or are we missing something from a production or health standpoint? So some of the things that we made sure we were doing properly from a production standpoint: full feed, heat checking multiple times per day, using plenty of boars, plenty of boar power, having fresh boars. All those things really didn't seem to make a difference in the end. But again, if you throw together the fact that there's a natural waxing and waning over time, it led to more confusion. So for a period of time, you up your boar power, and it felt like it was getting better, but then inevitably it would revert back to worse. PG600 and Matrix really didn't use a lot of that, didn't work particularly well. Mixed results with PG600, although we did use a lot of it. From a health standpoint, I know JP will get into this, but just anecdotally, some things we did on these farms all had on-site GDUs, and so on 2 of them, we decided to booster the entire growing gilt population from weaner all the way to selection with PCV2 and PCV3. In our diagnostic workup, we were finding a mutant PCB2 as well as PCB3. Anecdotally, when in the farms where we did that booster, we didn't notice a difference in the percent of animals ended up getting culled versus bred. So it really didn't have an impact. From a feed standpoint, one of the things, or some of the things we were thinking about is mycotoxins in the feed. There's some discussion about different sources of fat or oil, how that's changed in the diet over time and how that could possibly be playing a role. In this system, there was one farm that had a different gilt source, but would have had feed from the same mill as the affected herds. And so on the farm with the different gilt source but same feed, they really didn't have any issues as far as gilt fertility. And so in this system, it felt like feed was not part of the problem. So eventually you get to a point, you can imagine, where the farms become starved of gilts, and we decide to start breeding gilts despite strong estrus signs. So if she had a little swelling or maybe a little bit of reddening, we would breed her, and that was met with mixed results. We submitted live gilts to the U of M BDL, and really nothing from as far as a smoking gun standpoint in finding any issues. Kind of anecdotally, today on these farms, we continue to see, I would say, P1s, a higher proportion of P1s that don't stand to be mated post-weaning. And on some farms, it seems like they were better or more successful at breeding despite having very weak signs. They actually got some of these gilts to farrow. And on those same farms, it feels like there might be a higher proportion of P1s that once they come through and wean, we can't get them to stand post-weaning. And again, that's kind of anecdotal. Really didn't dig into it in the same extent that we did with the gilts, because in this system we had the opportunity to switch gilt sources with the same genetic company, but switch sources. And on these sites, like I said, there's GDUs that are on site, and so we would bring a replacement weaner in. And one of the things that we were worried about was, as we bring in this unaffected gilt source and essentially commingle or have fence line contact with the affected gilt source, if it was something infectious, would that get spread from the unaffected to the affected? The good news is to date, the new gilt source, despite that, we really haven't had any issues getting them to breed up. And so to the best of my knowledge too, I don't know if I've heard of a situation where a farm has changed gilt sources and that new gilt source that came in had issues breeding up, at least not that I've heard. And again, don't want to get into the data too much, but just illustrating, with the new source, we've had good luck getting those animals bred. So some final thoughts that I have from a vet-to-vet perspective. We do it quite a bit when we're shopping around for new gilt sources. I think, moving forward, for me, it's prudent to share that information. If I'm sending gilts from an affected gilt source, I think it's my job to share that. And the flip side is, if I'm receiving new gilts from a new source, in addition to PERS and PD and MICO and APP and all this stuff that we talk about in our group, we're making sure that we're asking all the appropriate questions to get to the bottom and figure out if there's any gilt fertility issues or not, and making sure that we're comfortable with that. And finally, I'd like to thank Dr. Neeram for his collaboration, but also JP and PIC for their willingness to participate in this and really lead this discussion, as well as continue to dig up on the diagnostic side. So I do appreciate that, so thank you.